cool, so cool.
From the 5th century, it was a time when the Roman Empire, which had survived almost 1,000 years, was at last crumbling. Attila the Hun was one of the barbarian leaders who struck terror into the hearts of all the Europeans of his day, and who led hundreds of thousands of people out of the mysterious East. Ladies and gentlemen, Attila the Hun. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Dickinson, gentlemen.
You know, until most Americans probably know nothing about the Huns. Because the Germans were called the Huns in our First World War, some of us think the original Huns were a German tribe.
Really?
Yeah,
Incredible.
I'm afraid so. Tell us, please, where did the Huns really originally come from?
Who knows where any people originally come from? Usually when people think that they're answering that question, all they are is explaining where their ancestors were living perhaps 1,000 years ago. But you could easily go back to that time and ask the same question with similar uncertainty. Where did a particular group come from? There were legends among my people that long after the time of Christ, the Chinese drove the Huan people westward out of Mongolia. Half of us stopped our migration in Afghanistan, while the rest moved on to what is now known as Eastern Europe. To this day, I understand that Turks consider us their ancestors. What little I know about the early history of my people leads me to believe that they came from what is the plains of Mongolia. The Mongols, I understand, survived until this very day.
Yes, but they are an Oriental people.
So,
You know, that's interesting. People who have visited Russia say in the streets of Moscow today, you can see some Mongols, even some Russians of mixed blood with decidedly Oriental features.
of course, as a matter of fact, how anyone on the earth can possibly talk about pure-blooded human stock is more than I can understand.
Yeah.
People who think that they are pure-blooded Germans or pure-blooded Italians or Irish or whatever are simply deluding themselves.
Why do you say that?
Because for thousands of years across the face of Europe and all other continents as well, has been an endless process of migration, war, pillage, rape, intermarriage, and intermingling of all kinds. My fighting men did not bring their wives along on their campaigns, I assure you. No, it's a rare man who can accurately trace his ancestry back 3 or 4 generations with complete certainty. In any event, my people originally came out of the east and slowly moved westward across the face of Europe.
I'm curious about your main activity. How did you support yourself?
By war, chiefly. Well, we naturally kept cattle, and we did a bit of farming, but we were great natural horsemen. And there was something in us that made us want to explore and dominate the areas unknown to us.
How dreadful.
What were some of the tribes you dominated?
The first people we conquered were the Russians. We moved into their territories in the year 355, attacked and gradually absorbed a number of their tribes. About 20 years later, we did battle with the Ostrogoths
The Ostrogoths. Where did they live?
in the Ukraine.
Okay.
How did you treat the tribes you conquered?
Well, I understand you have a modern expression. If you can't beat them, join them. Actually, that was a common practice in my day. When our armies were victorious, the people we defeated, those that were not killed anyway, usually were willing to join us, thus enlarging our forces. Gradually, we moved farther west and defeated the Visigoths in part of what is now called Germany. You know, I almost have a bit of sadness about the poor Visigoths.
Why is that?
Well, they not only had us to worry about, but they had a more complicated problem. They turned to their rear and appealed to the Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube and settle in Roman-controlled territory, just to get away from us. The Romans said it would be all right for them to come in, and then fell on them when they did. As As a result of the deceit and treachery of the Romans, the Goths eventually pulled themselves together and started a separate war with them. In 378, the Romans suffered their most disastrous defeat in almost 600 years, and they deserved it.
What accounted for the defeat of the Roman army?
Well, my own guess is that the Goths prevailed because they had learned something from the strategy of the Huns. We moved across the continent easily because we were on horseback, and it was the Gothic cavalry, you see, that defeated the Roman infantry.
Ah, yes, I remember having read that engagement. As a matter of fact, it's the victory of the cavalry over the foot soldiers that set the tone for the next 1,000 years.
Uh-huh, I see. Well now, at what point in history, Attila, did you personally appear on the scene?
I'll tell you, things went from bad to worse for the Romans, and finally in 410 the city of Rome itself fell and was pillaged by the Goths. Part of the Gothic force that took Rome consisted of Huns, and the Goths had trouble controlling them. At more or less the same time, another powerful tribe called the Vandals began to make their presence known. They came mostly from the provinces of what is now called East Germany and gradually moved south into Hungary. As the weakness of Rome became increasingly plain, the Vandals took advantage of the situation and ravaged all of Gaul, which we now call France. In the year 409, about 100,000 Vandals entered Spain. In 433, my uncle King Rua of the Huns died, and control of the army was thrown to me and my brother Leda. When Leda was killed, I took over.
Some historians suspect, sir, you were responsible for your brother's death.
You sure you want to take that position?
Well, were you as ruthless a conqueror as people today really seem to think?
I don't care what today's people think, but I was a military man, and I used whatever degree of force was necessary in any given situation. And as I look at the world today, I don't see that things have changed terribly much in that regard. Come to think of it, I did employ an idea that I think you modern folks have developed quite well, is what you call propaganda.
Propaganda?
Yes, as soon as my forces had come into an area and were threatening adjacent tribes, I would send out some of my men to tell the horrible stories about my cruelty. You see, I figured that if you can strike fear into people's hearts, you can save your own troops a lot of trouble. People are more inclined to give up before a fight than to stand against you.
And the Europeans never saw through this?
Not very often. You must remember that the Europeans were almost totally ignorant, uneducated, illiterate, and superstitious. Since practically everything they believed was myth and nonsense, they were guided largely by their fears. So I was able to take advantage of their cowardly imaginations, to terrify them with, I suppose, less actual bloodshed than I might otherwise have had to employ.
Were you yourself able to read and write?
No, lady, I was not. In my day, only scholars, churchmen could read.
Well, why didn't they share their knowledge with the poor peasants?
A good question, but I was no savage. Get that straight. I had my own definition of honor, and I thought that it was important to assure men that they would be justly treated if they did what they were told.
Well, did you live by a moral code?
As regards to my personal morals, sir, they were superior, I assure you. Definitely compared to what that of many of the Romans. In my capital, the city now called Budapest, I lived a simple life. I drank very sparingly and had no interest in luxury and riches.
Yes, Mrs. Dickinson, Miss Dickinson, pardon. Attila was no country rube. He was no ignorant barbarian savage. By the middle of the 5th century, he was the most powerful man in Europe and was being paid tribute by Theodosius II and Valentinian.
But see here, Attila, the murderous raids of your army of 500,000 men caused devastation and ruin across the face of Europe for centuries. It was over 400 years before the Balkans recovered from the scourge of your military forces. While you were no ignorant savage in one sense, it can hardly be argued that a man who would massacre the inhabitants of hundreds of cities across Russia, Germany, and France was civilized.
I wasn't aware, Mr. Darwin, that the British Empire was built by pacifists.
Well, then how were you finally defeated?
Well, in 451, Theodoric I, that old bastard, who was king of the Visigoths, made an alliance with the Romans, and their combined armies attacked mine near Troyes. It was one of the bloodiest battles in history of mankind. My 500,000 men against hundreds of thousands of theirs.
Yes, it was like a scene out of the Inferno. It said 162,000 men died in that battle.
Oh, horrible.
Oh, are you shocked by the number of deaths? Well, I understand that. But the 162,000 who died at Troyes were military men who knew their risks. You're an American, right, lady? And you, sir?
Yes.
Also? Well, I understand that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American forces killed just about 160,000, mostly civilian men, women, and children, in just a few minutes. And the Japanese themselves killed millions.
Yes, but modern nations at least try to avoid war.
I don't
Because
mind your being shocked or saddened by the prospect of bloody, painful death. Such reactions are, after all, your privilege to feel. But what I will not tolerate is the suggestion that you people today are somehow more civilized or more compassionate than the men of my day. If we were killers, then we were, but at least we were not hypocrites.
But surely, Attila, there's a difference.
Listen to me. In your Second World War, do you know how many people were killed?
Not exactly, no.
40 million. Yes, 40 million people were killed by the supposedly civilized modern nations. Think of that number of deaths, my friend. Roll that figure around in your minds. 40 million killed, a very large percentage of them civilians. Now, perhaps a pacifist or a saint might be able to call me out on moral account on the basis of their own spiritual superiority. But I'll be damned if I'll take such criticism from the likes of those who rule the world today.
This has got a little heavy. I'm going to change the subject. Let's put some questions to Dr.